Let's now return to our other big breaking story this hour. We heard from the Prime Minister a bit earlier this hour, Scott Morrison, saying that Australia will be sending around $70 million to fund military equipment, including ammunition and missiles, as well as other humanitarian support to Ukraine to help in its fight against Russia. Let's bring in live now Jeffrey Wilson, the Research Director at the Perth USAsia Centre. Jeffrey, appreciate your time. There's been a lot of discussion about what's going on the defence side of things, the military might of Ukraine compared to Russia, but we're also hearing a lot about the other war, the economic war that is being waged by the West against Russia. How much of an impact are the economic sanctions we've seen so far? How much of an impact has it had on Russia?
Well, look, the effect of these kind of economic sanctions is not instantaneous, but it will bite. We saw in the very first couple of days a number of kind of personal level sanctions around Putin and his bank accounts or those of his cronies. But what we've seen happen in the last 48 hours is serious hospital-grade economic sanctions, cutting Russian financial institutions out of the interbank network globally, and more recently trying to cut off the Russian central bank from its, $500 billion worth of gold foreign exchange reserves. These things have been coordinated by a group of allies, which is really critical. It's not down to what Australia or the US or the EU or its members can do on their own, but the strength of these regimes is only as good as how watertight they are. And so the fact that this has taken a few days to set up, but it's very heavily coordinated, means that there's going to be fewer escape ways for the Russian economy to get around these huge walls that have now been erected to it.
Well, that leads me to my next question, which is just how well placed is Russia to try and withstand this sort of action?
A lot of people expected it would be well placed because it has significant number of foreign exchange reserves, estimated at about 630 billion US dollars. But the recent move by a number of central banks in coordination to refuse to engage with the Russian central bank could be a game changer. That probably deprives them of effective access to 2/3 by some estimates of that amount, which means that their war chest to continue funding the economy while the rest of the sanctions are operating is greatly reduced. We've already seen the Russian central bank double exchange interest rates overnight, and the ruble collapse as well as a consequence of the market just pricing in where this is going to go. So this is going to have an extraordinary drain on the Russian economy in the coming weeks and months. An economic catastrophe for the Russian economy more broadly is inevitable at this point.
And when you look at the global situation, I mean, I know that I've interviewed you recently about trade wars. Usually we're talking about China. We've seen the supply chain issues around the world, the pandemic playing into that as well. In terms of the global flow-on effect here, how will this impact, for example, us sitting in Australia in terms of supply chain issues, imports, exports?
Look, that's really hard to tell because while we've had occasions where countries have been subject to this kind of sanction before, it's generally been small and systematically less important countries, Venezuela or Iran or something. This is the first time in modern history that a country that's as important in the global economy as Russia, we should remember its economic size is about the same as Australia's, has been effectively persona non grata from the global financial system. It's really hard to therefore, use history as a guide to work out how this is going to change. But one thing to remember is that these sanctions they don't work overnight, but they will work. These are going to have to be in place for a very long time to provide an economic deterrent to avoid some of the military activities that we're seeing depicted here. And as a result of that, this is not something that's going to snap back a week or a month after, whatever conflict situation we see on the ground ends. We should expect this is going to be a reality and a fact of life for the global economy for a significant time to come.
And just how significant is the support we're seeing from China on that front for Russia in terms of Russia's ability to withstand all of this?
Well, in the early days of the war, China announced a wheat import deal with Russia that was widely seen, to be a fairly scurrilous move on the day that Russia invaded another country, but also was an attempt to send a message to the rest of the world that, well, if you sanction them, we'll still trade with them for commodities. We'll still buy their products. So if you don't buy their gas, we could. These sanctions are a bit different because they're not on trade and commodity side, but they're financial measures designed to cut off the money side of the economy rather than the goods. China's been pretty silent in response to this so far, and it has in the past had a track record of not necessarily supporting, but not undermining Western financial sanctions in a number of cases over the last decade. What will be interesting is whether they continue to do that again. And certainly if China simply acquiesces to this, they'll have their effect.
What's the next round in terms of the West looking to inflict even further damage? I mean, what should we all sort of be watching out for in terms of what else is up their sleeve?
So these financial sanctions affect an entire economy, particularly the money supply in the banking system. But to prohibit Russia's ability to fight a prolonged war in Ukraine over months and years, one needs to cut off access to industry. And one of the main ways countries could do that was with trade bans, not selling things to Russia or not buying things from Russia. That's already happened in some countries in terms of high-tech goods like semiconductors and aerospace parts. But if this was to escalate further, we'd probably see some of those things coming into play as well. This would really cut at the ability of Russian industry to create the goods and materials required to sustain a long-term military occupation of another country. Those kind of moves won't be significant at the moment. They won't change what's happening on the ground right now. But unfortunately, if this does become a much longer-term and unpleasant conflict, they will become more relevant if in that situation.
Jeff Wilson, always appreciate your analysis. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me.